Good morning, Neil Hiscox, publisher of Canadian Auto Dealer, here with John White, National Director of Business Development with First Canadian, and of course, past president of CADA, here to share some of his perspectives on the pandemic, on dealer reaction, and some of what he sees going on out there. Good morning, John.
Morning, Neil. Thank you very much for having me on. Really appreciate it. And kudos for this series that you're doing. I think it's very informative for our industry. So well done.
Well, I appreciate that. And we're very, very happy to have your voice as part of it. In your current role, you absolutely have a view across the country. And I think you'll have some interesting thoughts to share. And of course, that's informed by your previous role, which lets you see the challenges dealers face perhaps through a slightly broader lens than some others might. So really happy to have the conversation. So let's dive right in. What do you see going on out there?
Yeah, well, sure. And also I'll probably add the fact that my perspective from my other roles working internationally may have helped, and I'd like to tie that in. So firstly, as you know, across the country, I'm in a fortunate position of having contacts with a broad base of industry stakeholders, be they with dealers, OEMs, be it with other stakeholders who are in the industry, such as us. And I've also taken the opportunity to reach out to some of my contacts either in the US, Australia, or abroad, just to get a sense of what's going on over there, to really get that macro picture. From our end, we deal with about 1,900 dealers around the country, so our guys have a pretty good perspective as well in speaking with dealers. So, it goes without saying that this is a challenging time. But more specifically, as we look in terms of what's going to happen, there are consistent themes, and those consistent themes are that recovery is going to be inconsistent. It's going to be uneven. It's going to be staged over time. It will be dependent on where you are in the country. And frankly, we don't see volumes that we were enjoying in the past returning anytime soon. You've seen the DesRosiers numbers this year. Looks like Dennis is predicting at least a -25, and I think next year is going to be just as difficult. That's the first thing that we see. The second thing that we're pretty sure is going to happen coming out of this is that consumers are going to become a lot more pragmatic. They're going to become more discerning, and they're going to become more value conscious in their purchases. And of course, thirdly, and everyone's been talking about that, business is going to be done differently as we come out of the crisis. So, these are definitely consistent themes that we're hearing from everybody. From a Canadian dealer perspective, coming into this, dealers, because of a combination of effects where, profitability was under pressure, and really what we're seeing now is that a lot of these profitability and liquidity pressures that dealers were facing will now become more acute as sales have basically dropped off the cliff. So the dealers that I've been talking to have basically said, John, we're going to take a holistic look at our operations. We're going to take a look at our cost structures. We're going to take a look at which roles are we going to need and in which quantity. For instance, I foresee a much bigger role for an internet manager. I foresee a much bigger role for BDCs, and then dealers are going to have to ask themselves, well, geez, am I going to have everybody crowded into one room, or perhaps will I run my BDCs from home or remotely through a third party? So dealers will be looking at that first of all, and from a consumer perspective, we believe that initially consumers are going to become quite reluctant to come in to visit their neighborhood dealer. And, social distancing, as you and I were talking before we went live, is with us for the foreseeable future. And, this is going to definitely accelerate a movement to online auto retail, not only in the front end of the business, but in the back end of the business. And it was really interesting to hear what Bob Verwey had to say when you interviewed him about some of the creative things that he was doing in terms of even as the back end of his business. So these are some of the things that the dealers are going to do. And then, right now, inventories were high coming into this. Obviously, inventories haven't turned. And when the customer comes out to buy, they're going to be looking for a good deal. And unfortunately, we're all going to be fighting over a more limited customer base. So dealers, industry partners such as ourselves and others, we're all going to have to adjust our ways of doing business. And we're going to need to work very hard together in helping dealers maximize their profitability at minimum cost. So at a high level, that's what we're seeing, my friend.
A lot of different threads I'd love to dive into a little bit there, and in no particular order. So when you say a pragmatic consumer, how does pragmatic manifest itself?
Sure. Well, I'm referring, when I'm speaking of pragmatic, I'm talking about maybe more rational. When you look at, right off the gate, what had happened is that some of the first things that started to go were some of the higher end sports car brands, for instance. Are people going to be stepping up to spend a lot of money for something that may be more of a conspicuous consumption? You're seeing it with cottage properties and recreational properties now. You're seeing elements like that. So consumers are probably going to be looking at this and saying, okay, do I need a car? And if I need a car, what am I going to buy? And is my purchase going to be much more rational? Now, of course, there's always going to be a segment of that population that is going to be, interested in more of that emotional buy. But, I believe that it'll be a little bit more pragmatic, thoughtful. A lot of people who will come in to buy will have been 1, 2, 3 months without any revenue other than maybe their federal, their federal check. What will happen to their mortgages? So, clearly, from that perspective, consumers are going to be looking at the automobile purchase a little differently.
Do you see this having a particularly disproportionate impact on luxury as a segment?
I believe the high luxury or sports luxury would be probably the first that would be at risk. I was reading some of Dennis DeRosier's analysis that he published a short while ago, and Dennis is always very thoughtful and gives a lot of detailed analysis to this. I've been looking at some of the JD Power data as well, and you're starting to see some trends right off the bat. And for sure, I believe that that's at risk.
What about at sort of the very opposite end of the spectrum? If people have had to live for some number of months or quarters, depending on how long it goes, in a social distancing scenario, you're starting to see a lot of people writing about or speculating about reluctance to use public transit, reluctance to get into an Uber or a Lyft car. Is there a chance this actually drives more activity in more entry-level segments where people are saying, I actually want to have my mobility linked to a personal space, whereas before I may have been more willing to have a shared space?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Initially, maybe not, because people will be, especially those at the lower end, maybe a little bit more cash-strapped. So wanting to have your transportation versus being able to afford it. Now, what that could mean is, there may be, the market may be coming down, but it's also going to drive perhaps maybe more interest in the used car business. And, from a used car perspective, there's a lot of cars coming off lease, probably going to be quite a few repossessions that are going to be out there. So perhaps the used car business is going to be an area of opportunity. But I wouldn't see a mad dash right now to car buying. That being said, as you look at how long this could continue on, there is a possibility that you're going to see a certain segment of those people step back. I know that myself right now, the last thing I want to do is to get on a subway, get on a bus, or go sit in a sports stadium with a lot of other people. I want them away.
I have to say, for a dyed-in-the-wool Habs fan, those season tickets, they've got to be burning a bit of a hole in your pocket. But at the same time, like you say, you're not going to be in any hurry to go into the new form anytime soon.
No, well, I don't want to get into a long discussion about the Habs, and I would certainly not want to give any shot to any Leafs fans out there, but I'm starting to sympathize with Leaf fans in terms of how my hockey team is doing, but perhaps that's for another discussion.
Yeah, fair enough. Let's talk a little bit. I mean, you as you alluded to, you're a past OEM head. You certainly have a really good sense of what goes on inside the halls and what the pressures are inside the halls of an OEM. Let's talk a little bit about there. You alluded to inventory, and for sure, there's a lot of inventory on dealers' lots. At the same time, once activity returns, manufacturing of vehicles isn't going to suddenly ramp up overnight. Do you actually talk a little bit about some of the challenges that's going to entail?
Mm-hmm. Well, prior to going into this, I had visited dealers from many brands, and without naming any OEMs, some OEMs that I knew of before this had 2019 model year cars that they had inventory of for the remainder of this year. I saw other brands who their district managers were calling their dealers at some point daily to have them take open stock. So there was a lot of inventory that was available out there, depending, of course, on the manufacturers. Some manufacturers do a much better job in planning this out. But look, let's be honest. The market, which was at a peak of 2 million cars a year last year, went down to 1.91, I believe it was. And so what happens then? Well, as an OEM, you're trying to get, you want to make sure that you keep your production going up. Now, what has happened is many OEMs have now slowed down production. Some are turning around and manufacturing other products. The parts business is going to be very interesting because manufacturers will rely, of course, on their parts supply. So what will happen most likely right now is that OEMs are going to slowly ramp up that production. If you look at VW, I think they closed their plants for 4 or 5 weeks. I may have the number of weeks wrong, but nevertheless, it was about a month. And others have done the same thing. So it's going to take a while for this inventory to make its way through the system because the rate of travel will definitely not be what it was.
Curious to know your thoughts on, a couple of weeks ago, we did an interview with Michael Carmichael, who's a dealer here in Toronto, and he had put forward an idea, basically job loss insurance to support new vehicle buyers, and had spoken to the importance that a program like that could have in getting people who may be re-engaged from an employment standpoint, but certainly once bitten, maybe twice shy in terms of undertaking a major purchase. What are your thoughts on something like that? I mean, it's existed in the market, it's existed in different locations in the market, but how important could something like that be to get consumers willing to undertake a significant?
Well, first of all, consumers have the option of buying involuntary job loss protection when they buy an insurance product when they're financing their vehicle. So that is an option that is available to them out there in the marketplace, which ourselves and companies such as ourselves offer up around the country. I'm not sure that from a public policy perspective, and if it would be a a great idea for government to get involved in that. And I think that there are other things, if I'm understanding your question appropriately, that could be done to better stimulate demand from a government perspective. And I think I had heard Tim Royce at CADA and those guys talking about other measures which could help getting things going.
Let's talk a little bit more about what you see going on out there and what you think is going to need to happen from an F&I perspective. Obviously, this is the backyard you're focused on right now, but give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So, that's a great question, because what's been happening is that front-end gross profits have been eroding over time. And as I mentioned earlier, with the fact that most likely supply being higher than demand, that there's going to be a lot of pressure that is going to continue on new car sales and on the pricing and the profitability of new car sales. So from an F&I perspective, there's probably going to be an opportunity there. Dealers need to be able to derive as much money, as much profit from their F&I department that they do from their new and used car department on a per car basis. So consumers, and earlier I was talking about, pragmatism, a consumer may be much more open today to purchase, let's say, a critical illness or life and disability or job loss protection plan than they may have been in the past. I mean, the whole world, I believe, is looking at things a little bit differently. I believe that consumers are going to still look at wanting to finance long-term. Extended term financing was something that was in vogue, a lot of negative equity financing. That too is probably a subject for another time. But I believe that consumers are going to want to be spreading out their payments as much as possible. So what opportunity will that provide? Well, that'll provide an opportunity for dealers perhaps to make money with an extended mechanical breakdown, extended warranty plans. So for the dealers that look at this appropriately, dealers are going to have to look at their F&I department. And sometimes what we've seen is F&I managers, some of them that have been around a long time get maybe set in their ways and say, well, I'm doing it this way. I think that there'll be an opportunity to look at these things a little bit differently. Now, the other challenge that there'll be is that in the days of social distancing, where the consumer may not have all the time to spend with their F&I manager, that in itself is going to provide other challenges to work around. But I believe, and we believe, that clearly F&I becomes a huge opportunity in this condition today, and because you're going to have that perfect storm of greater customer awareness and a more pragmatic purchaser.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me, but I think you touched on something important, which is consumers' willingness to, coming into this, we already knew that consumers felt it took too long at the dealership. The amount of time it took was too long. Now we have a whole other problem, which is I don't want to be shut in a business office with a business manager from a distancing standpoint. But when we look at moving the business online, I think it's safe to say F&I is not as online as it needs to be. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's a fair statement. There's a lot of dealer desking software programs out there or that are being introduced. The one weakness to those software, to those desking programs, is that F&I is treated as, okay, I want to get the paper bought, I want to finance the car, whether it's a finance or a lease, and that just happens to be one component. That can't happen. If it does happen, then obviously the consumer is is not going to have the time to take a look at what the offerings are. So what you need to have a very good menu selling program. You need to have a good online tool that is going to provide the F&I manager with this opportunity to talk directly to the consumer online, to show them online specifically what they can purchase or finance, and to go through that process like you and I are going through it right now, being able to share on my screen. So from our end, we had looked at that, and I'm sure other of our competitors have been looking at that as well, and we were fairly down the line. So what we did as part of all of this is we looked at our financial investments and accelerated our investments into that to be able to get a tool out there in the marketplace, which we're testing right now with certain dealers. So I believe that to have effective F&I business in these days of social distancing, you're going to have a good menu selling online program, and then of course the other thing is that you need to have the customer sign like you have right now in real estate transactions with DocuSign. We have something similar called iSign, and there's certain jurisdictions that will accept online signatures. There are certain jurisdictions that do not yet, but I believe that the provincial jurisdictions will most likely be more open to that as we move forward, the way they are on real estate transactions. So these are going to be the things that dealers are going to have to look out for. So as a dealer, and I go back to earlier when I say that, I'm looking at my structure, I'm looking at where I'm going to invest. As a dealer, I'd be wanting to look at where am I, what's my ability to do my business online, front end, back end, fixed and variable, and to be able to take that whole transaction and still be able to keep the relationship with the consumer. And that's where the challenge and the opportunity is for the dealers that get on this right away.
I think that's actually a great spot for us to cut it off, John. You and I have done this a lot over the years. We could talk for a long time, and I think there's some other areas we can come back to. But I think for now, I think that's a great discussion. I really appreciate the insight, and let's keep the conversation going, because this is going to be a challenge for the months and quarters ahead, for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you having me on, and I hope that your viewers will have found some of this discussion to be value added, and be glad to come on anytime. And I wish you well, and I wish all the dealers out there and all your viewers well, and good luck, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. John White and Neil Hiscock signing off for Canadian Auto Dealer.